Gentlemen, please be seated. We are about to begin our session titled Perspectives on Economic Reform Agenda for Pakistan. I would like to request the panelists and the moderator to take their seats on stage. Please switch off your mobile phones or put them in silent mode. There will be a question-answer session at the end of the discussion. We would appreciate it if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. Our moderator for the session is Vaqar Ahmed. He is a distinguished economist and Joint Executive Director at SDPI. Are we ready, Vaqar? Yes? Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the Oxford University Press for yet again hosting us and allowing the chance to discuss what's probably the most precious at the moment, and that's the economy. So it's probably something which ends up biting everyone at the end of the day, no matter which channel one talks through. But of course, it's something which is on the mind of the government. It's something which is on the mind of a common person. So really grateful to the Oxford University Press for this opportunity and for discussing this subject. Let me, by way of a formal beginning, introduce my very esteemed panel here today. I'm joined by, first of all, Dr. Hafiz A. Pasha, who's former United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Regional Bureau of Asia and Pacific of UNDP. Dr. Pasha held a number of important public positions. He served as Federal Minister for Finance, Federal Minister for Commerce, Federal Minister for Planning, and as well as he has been advising various governments on this very topic, which is the agenda for economic reforms. He has written a book across 2 volumes, which is available right outside this room for those who'd like to have an extended reading around his thought. Of course, this brief introduction doesn't do justice with the extensive experience that he has had. We'll shortly be joined by Dr. Sania Nishtar Saiba. I'll introduce her formally at that point. We're also honored that we have with us Mr. Mohammad Ziauddin Saab, who's a Pakistani, very senior Pakistani economic journalist with 45 years of career behind him. He served as the president of South Asia Free Media Association. He was also the executive editor of the Express Tribune. He not only contributed extensively to the economic journalism discourse in Pakistan, but also has been advising the various governments in his own right. I'm also joined by my fellow colleague and, of course, a co-curator and co-organizer of this session, Dr. Jochen Hippler, who's the current country director of FES Pakistan. He's former TNI director. He's a specialist on the Muslim Middle East and Central Asian politics. Of course, also brings an extensive experience from Germany, where he belongs from. He's also writing a book, and if we have time, we'll talk further about it. And maybe by way of course, welcoming all of you to this session, and of course, by way of FES Pakistan collaborating to co-organize this session and bringing all of us together, I could start with Jochen probably. So Jochen, FES Pakistan has now long been working towards encouraging the debate around economy of tomorrow and how should the economy of tomorrow in Pakistan look like. I understand that Dr. Hafiz Pasha was also a convener of that group when it started, you know. So I'd probably like you to touch upon that and maybe we can take it from there then. It's over to you, please.
Very well, thank you very much. Let me just briefly, before answering the question, say that I am very happy that we again cooperate with the Islamabad Literature Festival and also with SDPI. And I am especially happy and proud about FAS' long relationship with Dr. Hafiz Pasha, which is one of our closest friends and whom we are very happy to cooperate with such a long and fruitful cooperation. My office told me if I'm on the podium, I should not dare not to show the books that have been mentioned. If I wouldn't do it, I would be probably killed in the office tomorrow. So this is the 2 volumes which we are so proud that, having done them with Dr. Pasha, and as it was said, they are outside available, and then there is a short summary of the political recommendations. Having said that, I will probably interrupt for a minute for greeting. So, when we're starting a couple of years ago to have a project line about the economy of tomorrow in regard to Pakistan, that was in the context that the foundation has worked in Pakistan since the early 1990s, and we decided that the discussion in this country, but also in Europe and globally, very often was too narrowly focused on just macroeconomic indices, instead of linking the economic discussion both with the changing character of the economy, globalization, digitalization, and things like such, and also with the questions of economic justice and not just economic proficiency, and to link it with questions of governance, because we were very sure and could see very much that economic topics and questions and problems were very closely linked to governance problems in all countries of the world. So that's the short background. I could go in for another hour, but for humanitarian reasons I will not.
Thank you, Jochen, and it's good to have you back in Pakistan once again. Yes, I really look forward to working with you. So as I had introduced very briefly, I'm very grateful to Dr. Sania Nishtar Saiba. She's just joined us, and by way of a formal introduction, she is Prime Minister of Pakistan's Special Assistant and Federal Minister for Poverty Alleviation and Social Protection. She also chairs the Benazir Income Support Program, which is Pakistan's biggest social safety nets institution. And she also chairs the Government of Pakistan's Council on Poverty Alleviation. I understand she has probably returned back a couple of hours ago from the US. I can imagine how tired she must be. And many congratulations, Dr. Saiba, on a very successful engagement with the Gates Foundation. We're all very proud of you and proud of your efforts. So maybe, Jochen, I could now move to Dr. Hafiz Pasha, given that the kind of introduction which you gave to the work which you and colleagues have been conducting in Pakistan. Dr. Sab, your book was recently published. Jochen just introduced the book. And the timing of the book was very interesting because immediately after the book came out and there were certain recommendations from the government, Pakistan had to move into a fund program, a program with the International Monetary Fund. So probably I'll leave the question open-ended for you. Where does the economy stand at the moment, and just your independent viewpoint on what are the scenarios going forward from here for the government, So very briefly, if you could start with that, and then we can be more focused later on.
Bismillah. Thank you for the introduction. Let me start by saying that this current year, 2019-20, is actually a year which is somewhat characterized by a relatively high degree of uncertainty. And I start by saying that this uncertainty is at various levels. Certainly, I would first focus on the global level and then come down to the Pakistani level and possibly also the regional context. The first uncertain element is that the world economy is beginning to slip perhaps into a recession after a gap of almost a decade. And this has, of course, been primarily driven by the trade war between the United States and China. which has restricted the volume of world trade. The implication of this is both positive and negative. For Pakistan, it's negative in the sense that it will probably affect the prospects for our exports. But on the other hand, import prices have already started falling. And in the first 2 months of the current year, we have seen a significant fall of 6% overall in the prices of imports, including petroleum. The second element of uncertainty at the global level is what is going to be happening to the oil price. You know, we are predominantly an oil importer. We import almost $14 to $15 billion worth of petroleum, crude, and products. And the last few days, literally, we have witnessed a kind of a seesaw in the price of oil following the attack on Saudi oil installations. Initially, the price jumped up to the early 70s. It has since come back somewhat. And the issue, however, is that the supply, of course, was substituted by the USA. But given the Middle East context and the Iranian sanctions and so on, it remains unclear as to what could happen to oil prices in the weeks and months to come. It could happen that it would fall. On the other hand, there's always the risk that it could rise. The third and very important, perhaps regional and domestic context, is the situation with regard to peace and security in our own region. The first is the situation in Indian-held Jammu and Kashmir, which has been a real source of concern for Pakistanis, and I say with a great sense of pride that our Prime Minister delivered an outstanding speech at the United Nations General Assembly and reflected our views. Thank you, President, and for giving my Prime Minister that much time. Having been a former Assistant Secretary General, I know the time sometimes is short. The implication of this is that clearly there has to be a higher degree of preparedness on the part of Pakistan. We will have to focus now on strengthening our resources for defense. And I must recognize that this year in the budget, the armed forces voluntarily said we don't want an increase in our budget. And this was really quite remarkable, and we must thank the Army for doing that. The civil administration continued to grow by almost 30% this year. But now we will have to contend with the reality that military expenditure may have to be augmented even for defensive reasons. The fourth factor is, of course, the internal political situation, and you cannot be oblivious to that. We all like to hope that there will be a degree of rapprochement and common understanding and a focus on development of some kind of an economic consensus, but that has not happened. And there is already this tension between the opposition and the government, and we hope that does not lead to any kind of a protest or a public strikes or any form of dislocation of economic activity at this time would really affect our short-run prospects. Then I come to the more direct economic variables. The first element of uncertainty relates to how is the Federal Board of Revenue going to perform. This agency has certainly acquired a central place in the economic scenario for Pakistan. They have accepted a target of 44% increase in their revenues this year, and up till now they're somewhere between 15 and 20%, so we are very worried as to what the implications of a shortfall which could exceed at current rate 600 to 700 billion, how is that going to be filled? And this has vital implications on the size of our fiscal deficit. The other question, which is also a very serious question in terms of uncertainty, is during the first and second quarterly reviews by the IMF, how will they react to this shortfall? Will they be sympathetic to Pakistan given the fact that the base year numbers were wrong? And clearly there are broader considerations as to why Pakistan should be given some kind of support at this time. So will we get a waiver, or will there be some tough attitude in terms of asking us to come with a mini budget where we may have to raise taxes a bit more and perhaps even cut back on our spending? The other element of uncertainty is the future path of the exchange rate and the interest rates. Currently, there's a growing perception that they have reached a peak level. The interest rate is up, the policy rate, to 13.25%. It's more than doubled in the last year. And there's a general feeling that maybe the State Bank of Pakistan moved too fast in raising the interest rates, and this has had a negative impact on the economy. The exchange rate also was brought down very rapidly. There is evidence now that the rupee is actually undervalued by something like 10%. So hopefully, the last few weeks we have witnessed a degree of stability in the rupee, and we like to think that that will continue. So the good scenario is if there is moderation in the depreciation of the rupee in coming months, particularly since we have had success in controlling the current account deficit to almost half. The last and perhaps very important uncertainty relates to the financing of our external requirements, which is the current account deficit plus the rapidly increasing external debt repayments that we have to make. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll be perhaps somewhat worried to learn that Pakistan has an external financing need this year of almost $20 billion. This is a colossal amount. And we have, of course, the umbrella of the IMF program, but even in the presence of the IMF program, recently Modi's has said that Pakistan is one of the few countries in the world which has serious external financing risks. So that is a real risk factor. To get to this $20 billion of external financing, we will need to have sell bonds, euro and sukuk, $3 billion or more. We will have to borrow from international commercial banks, $4 to $5 billion. We will need budget support continuing from Islamic and other countries for like the oil deferred facility from Saudi Arabia. And we will hope that the multilaterals and the bilaterals go back to at least at the minimum, to their old levels of support to Pakistan. So ladies and gentlemen, there are these 7 factors. It could be going this way or that way, and you can have a downside scenario when many of these factors turn negative, or you could have a positive scenario if we are able to avoid some of the downside risks in the next few months and weeks. My own assessment, ladies and gentlemen, is that at this point, if you ask me to give an assessment of the outcome for this economy, I'll have to give you a range. The positive scenario, Pakistan could possibly, despite the pressure of stabilization, achieve a 3.5% growth rate. In the event the negative factors dominate, particularly if we have a situation where the recession begins to dramatically affect our exports and so on, and we have to cut back on our development spending in order to meet the deficit targets, you may see a growth rate which plummets down to hardly 2%. Either way, this is not a sensationally high growth rate. Inflation, again, is the other key variable. In the event Pakistan is unable to fulfill particularly its external financing needs, in the next few weeks and months, unfortunately, we may face some pressure on the exchange rate. We may have to cut our current account deficit even more, and the end result could be that while we are seeing temporarily some stability, mind you, last week reserves fell. And in November, Pakistan has to make a lump sum $1 billion payment as the repayment against the sukuk bond that we had floated years ago. So we could move into a period of uncertainty with regard to the level of foreign exchange reserves, in which case the exchange rate could dip. And believe me, if that were to happen, we will be in the middle range in terms of a two-digit inflation rate, 13, 14, 15%. On the other hand, if God wills and we are able to meet our financing needs and we are able to continue to keep cutting our current account deficit by more than half, God willing, by the June 2020, we will be back to a single-digit inflation rate. I won't go into too many other details. Let me, however, just tell you that I have looked at Pakistan for many, many years, of the last almost 3 to 4 decades. But let me tell you, this year is in a way an interesting, but perhaps a relatively uncertain year, because global, regional, domestic, all three uncertain elements have come together. And we can all, of course, pray for a good outcome, and inshallah, our people who have had to bear a lot of stress, inshallah, I hope that they will not be further put under pressure this year. Thank you.
Doctor, thank you for this very in-depth analysis, and you've been writing about it, you've been speaking about it. I'm very glad that the government also is seeking inputs and advice from you. You did talk about inflation, about which I'm sure the government is mindful, and probably Dr. Sania will later talk about the EHSAS program, which actually tries to mitigate a lot of those hardships which the public faces during the adjustment period. But maybe before that, because you also linked this to the fact that we need to kickstart the economic growth rate in the country as well. And maybe I could bring in Ziauddin Saab here, because just yesterday the World Bank report came out which said that in terms of ease of doing business, Pakistan had made a significant improvement. And in fact, in the World Bank's top 20 reformers list, it is Pakistan which actually features. And they did point towards 5 or 6 key areas in which the government had made improvements, and cost of doing business had come down in terms of registering businesses, SMEs, regulatory burden was reduced, access to utilities. On the other hand, there could be a different story which one hears from the business community themselves. So as somebody who has been talking to both sides, how do you currently see the business climate in Pakistan, and particularly for the small and medium enterprises who are supposed to be the engines of economic growth, which Dr. Pasha was talking about? Please, sir.
Dr. Vaqar, thank you very much for having me in this panel. I'm rather honored to share with such a distinguished panelists. Your question about World Bank having improved our position rather on ease of doing business. I mean, we now today are part of 20 countries which have, in the last 1 year, have made doing business rather much more easier. There are about 9 indicators. Out of those 9 indicators, World Bank says that we have improved our position, 6 of it. The last year, we had this position at the 136th rank. And I'm sure when they announce the ranking by mid-October, our ranking perhaps would have improved a lot. And I believe the Board of Investment had done a lot in having this improvement in the ease of doing business. Harun Sharif was the chief of BOI when perhaps he was instrumental in getting it done. But having said that, and as you said, our businessmen are not very happy with the situation. See, actually, these indicators rather show a kind of a situation which is more of a presumption. It's a presumption of the World Bank that if you have all these indicators improved, the ease of doing business, the situation of doing business would improve. But it is if you look at the ground situation, normally these indicators do not help much. Actually, after having listened to Dr. Pasha giving you a rundown on Pakistan's economy, the state of affairs in the economy today, and how does he see it rather shaping up in future. I feel rather very small to say anything about the kind of economy which would which would actually show signs of improvement. See, personally, I think the very economic model which Pakistan has been following for the last 70 years is faulty. See, we are short of, we have energy deficit, we have capital deficit, and our access to technology is very, very poor. With that kind of a situation, you can only live on dole. That we have been doing for the last 70 years. We are a dole-dependent country. And those people who give us aid, they dictate our economic policies, political policies, and other policies as well. And the biggest asset which we have, that is the youth bulge. We have continued to neglect that. We have neglected education, so much so that today about 22 million school-going children are out of school. And obviously look at the kind of standard of quality of education which is prevalent today in Pakistan. So we have neglected that. And then there is another aspect which we keep on neglecting when we are planning for our economy. That is, we are in a state of war for the last 40 years. And if you look at our economic policies, if you look at our budgets, you will feel as if Pakistan is the most peaceful country. It has got nothing to do with any war. But if you see, in the 1980s were war years, 1990s war years, because we were fighting on behalf of Taliban against Ahmed Shah Massoud, and then we have been fighting on behalf of Kashmiri freedom fighters in Indian occupied Kashmir we were fighting during this 1990s low intensity 10 long year wars, and then the 21st century, all this first decade, and even then up till 1990 we are in a state of war. We are fighting war on terror, and those two wars, the war against Soviet Union, we fought a proxy war for the Americans, and the war on terror, again, this was also a proxy war for the Americans, and they gave us the money for that, and that money has been running our economy. So when you have that kind of an economy, you simply cannot have a self-sustaining, self-sufficient economy. And then see, we cannot have. Look at the kind of social indicators. Education we are neglecting, health we have neglected, housing we have neglected, communication we have neglected, transport we have neglected. If you don't give your citizen these 5 fundamental things, how would you expect the citizen to have a feeling of belonging to the country and get him to work for the country? So this kind of, as I said, this kind of a model would never work. We have to change that model. As Mr. Jochen said about the economy of tomorrow, I think we should be thinking on those lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziauddin Saab. I also wanted to ask you about the skills gap, but maybe I'll do that in the next round. You've been writing a lot about that. And maybe I can now turn to Dr. Sania Sahiba. Many of the things which I think Ziauddin Saab pointed out, particularly the 4 or 5 hardships that a common citizen faces, I think this is perhaps the intervention that a common person requires, particularly those who are below the poverty line. That intervention has been modeled through this government into the SARS program, you know. And this is not, if I understand correctly, Dr. Sahiba, this is not something which is just on the paper, it's already been rolled out, you know. So maybe you could give us a brief about that, and how does it sort of mitigate some of the challenges which Dr. Hafiz Pasha and Ziauddin Saab also mentioned, please.
So, Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and good morning, good afternoon rather. I'm delighted to be on the panel with such distinguished individuals, and feel very honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation. We launched the SR strategy about 10 days ago, soliciting public comment. And this was the first time in the history of the country that a major document has been put in the public domain prior to its finalization. The reason why I'm drawing your attention to this is because you would see an absence of a poverty target. And this is precisely for the reasons that Hafiz Saab outlined. Ordinarily, when you put out a poverty strategy document, you would have expected to see that if the poverty levels by the consumption metric have declined from the 60% figure back in the 1980s to the 24% as it stands now, notwithstanding the limitations of measurement. I'm not getting into that. But if these are the official figures, you would have expected to see in the strategy document that I launched a target, and that target is missing. Why is that the case? It is because of the considerations that Hafiz Saab outlined. It is premature to talk about a hard outcome at this point because of the uncertainties that we face, and the government is conscious of that. And I think the government took a considered decision that rather than opting for the rhetoric, you should be very truthful with people. We are uncertain for the next 1 year, and therefore we said on page 4 or 5 of the strategy document that this is a living document. We will come back and revise the targets based on the economic situation. But yes, you will see a very clear sense of direction on where we're headed in terms of the social protection part. And the reasons for that were also elaborated in Hafiz Saab's summary, because we realize that the growth rate is likely to be slow, at least for the next 1 year or 2. And therefore, we risk people slipping down the poverty line. And in order to build a hedge against that, we need to have a very comprehensive social protection strategy. Now and of course, when you look at the strategy paper, you will see clear numbers, clear targets, clear institutional arrangements in support of that, and I'm just going to dilate on that in a minute. But just to digress a little and to talk about SARS more broadly, SARS basically is a multi-sectoral and a multi-stakeholder program. It's an umbrella initiative, and it currently has 134 policies, programs, and initiatives. And all these initiatives are meant to drive and use all the engines and the levers of the government of Pakistan to address state capture and to move the needle towards addressing inequality and addressing human capital development. It's a massive program with execution responsibility resting with 34 federal agencies and all the participating federal units. And the program comprises 4 pillars. The first pillar is centered on making the government system work for equality and addressing state capture, because I'm sure the experts would know that is fundamental to addressing poverty and equality within the country. I mean, state capture is evident in land use management, in crop choices, in water management, in many decisions that our governments have taken over the last 60 years. And therefore, certain systematic policy interventions to address state capture is absolutely vital to the agenda of equality and poverty eradication. That's one aspect of SRs, and the execution of that is the responsibility of several entities. The second aspect of SRs is about human capital development, predicated on the understanding that in today's digital age, countries will not be able to compete in the economies of today and especially of the future if they don't invest in human capital, because human capital is now considered to be the greatest wealth of a nation. In fact, as soon as 2025, the international financial institutions will start calculating the borrowing costs of countries according to the human capital indices, which is why we cannot extricate it from that consideration from any equation centered on poverty and inequality. So that's the second dimension. Again, specific interventions, specific outcomes are the responsibility of different agencies. And then there are the two related aspects of safety nets, one safety net centered and the other straddling social security and social protection, and allied to that, the jobs and livelihoods. And that's part of what has been tasked to me. It's hugely daunting, very humbling, which is why I put the strategy out for public comment, because nobody has an exclusive on wisdom, and everybody anytime anyone writes to me with feedback, I learn, and I cascade those learnings into the strategy document. So in terms of the social protection, the safety net and the allied jobs section of SRs, we have different programs targeting different sections of disadvantaged populations. But even before that, we had to create the institutional architecture, the backbone for that. You cannot deliver programs when your institutions are not functioning properly, when they have glaring gaps. And of course, we know that there are massive issues. So even before the programs, there were 6 things that we had to do. Number one, the institutional architecture had to be reformed. So previously, the different institutions of social protection were attached to different agencies. And that posed a huge impediment to policy coherence. There was massive fragmentation. BISP was attached to Ministry of Finance. The special projects were under the Planning Commission. Zakat was with the Cabinet Division. I beg your pardon, Zakat was with the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Pakistan Baitul Mal was with the Cabinet Division. So one of the decisions that the government took was to put all these vehicles of social protection under the new division of poverty alleviation safety nets. That's the first thing. Secondly, our data was very old. The National Socioeconomic Registry was made in 2010, and up until even now, we are giving all the stipends and all the benefits and all our special programs are constructed on the same registry. So the other thing that we did was that we fast-tracked the work of the National Socioeconomic Registry. This was work initiated by the previous government, and we acknowledged the work that they did in constructing the fabric of the National Socioeconomic Registry. So we fast-tracked that work, and inshallah the Socioeconomic Registry will be ready for deployment by early 2020. The third thing that we did was that we went into a new procurement for the digital payment system. So Pakistan's digital payment system, through which 7 million people get cash benefits, was again made in 2008. And of course, it is very easy to criticize something in hindsight because you have the learnings which were not there at that time. And of course, the digital payment system created then had many weaknesses. So we went into a new procurement which has now come to fruition. This has been one of the most difficult procurements of the government of Pakistan. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing, which I personally felt very passionate about, is the governance and integrity, the SR's governance and integrity policy. So this is a 32 faceted policy, the compliance with which was made mandatory with all institutions executing SRs, and this is quite an uphill task. I invite all of you to read the policy and give us your feedback. It's appended to the strategy document which we released. Number 5, the budget. So institution, payment systems, data, and governance frameworks are not enough. You have to back it up with money. And I think that is where the decision of the government to allocate 193 billion towards social protection, and all this is primarily towards the social protection component of SRs, was a very courageous decision. As Hafiz Saab just outlined, please bear in mind that this is an environment, this is an extremely financially austere environment, an environment in which even the armed forces have voluntarily cut back on their budgets. None of our social sector, which traditionally would get incremental increases in budget, none of them have gotten substantial increases in budget. And here the government escalated the budget for social protection to 193 billion. I think that was a very courageous decision, and it was welcomed by all factions of the society. And number 6, we're creating new tools and instruments to engage the private sector, because our private sector plays a very constructive role in social protection, but they are not harnessed in the government's mainstream. We never factor in their contributions when we look at social protection metrics holistically, and never leverage them systematically. So when you go to our division's website, you will see that there is a special portal for making pledges to SRs. And once we receive a pledge, we ascertain how to factor it towards the different time-bound outcome-based metrics that we have outlined for SRs. So these 6 foundational pillars were extremely important: the creation of the ministry, the budget, accelerating the work on the National Socioeconomic Registry, the procurement of the new digital payment system, the governance and integrity policy, and new metrics and new instruments and tools to engage the private sector and the civil society more constructively. And I'm just coming from New York, where of course we've augmented the resources for SRs through a memorandum of understanding with the Gates Foundation, and we have also entered into a new phase of agreement with the State Department, particularly with regard to the trainings and jobs for women, which are going to factor into the SRs programs as well. So once we have created these 6 pillars on which the social protection framework stands, I just want to talk a little bit about the programs, because the programs are targeted to different factions within the disadvantaged pool of people. Number 1 is Kifalat, and this is not in order of priority. So Kifalat is basically the program which reforms the BISP's cash transfer initiative, because previously the 6 million women that were getting cash transfers under the Benazir Income Support Program, now these women are going to get not just cash transfers but also bank accounts and access to mobile phones and access to internet services through 600 digital hubs, and the Tehsil offices of BISP and Baitul Mal are being converted into digital hubs. They're in most Tehsils, 600 in all. And the objective is that within this pool of 7 million women and their families, we understand that 30% of them will never be able to graduate out of poverty, but with access to a digital and financial inclusion, with access to mobile phones, with access to internet services, coupled with the other ease of business tools that the government is institutionalizing, there is a certain percentage of women and their families which will be able to take benefit. Not just that, on the 5th of July, we launched the National Poverty Graduation Initiative. And that was predicated on the understanding that these women who are now empowered through bank accounts, through cell phones, through access to internet, will also be able to avail the opportunities that are provided through that program. So on a monthly basis, we are giving out 80,000 loans. There is a program of asset transfers and linkages to skills development. The skills development component is something that yet needs to be concretized as part of this framework. All of these are predicated on the understanding that some people will be able to stand on their feet. Some people will have the capacity to graduate out of poverty, and hence the National Poverty Graduation Initiative, and hence the collaboration with the private sector in the United States, who are investing now, and through a focused approach will be able to create livelihood opportunities for women. Also, under the SR's umbrella, we are coming up with an agriculture value chain development policy. With special incentives, with tax breaks, with access to working capital, grant equity, debt equity, again on the understanding that when the private sector invests in agriculture value chain building in the environments where people have been empowered with digital financial inclusion, there will be some spin-off effect despite the slow growth rate. So that's one strand of one programmatic strand with different facets, interrelated facets. I come to the number two now, and number two is another window under SRs called the Hafiz. The Hafiz is Pakistan's first social protection window which caters to catastrophic events. I get lots of applications of people who are not covered under insurance, people with cancer and heart disease and with catastrophic health related risks. I get lots of applications from people whose homes are close to the line of control and their houses have been bombed. I have no vehicle to help them. I get lots of applications from women who can't earn and whose husbands have died. I have no window to help them. I get lots of applications from young girls who have been beaten, thrown out of the house by their in-laws, need a lawyer's fee. I have no window to help them. So Tahaffuz is the government of Pakistan's first window to help people who've suffered catastrophic risks. Now that's the second category of people. The third category of people are the disabled. And for the first time, maybe I shouldn't say the first time, but there's very serious effort to have a comprehensive policy targeted at them. So 2 months ago, several of us in the cabinet announced the disability policy, which centers on universal access to health through the Insaf card, universal access to assistive devices by February 2020, special quotas in housing, strict implementation of the jobs quotas that the disabled have. So that's another category. Then there is another category, another space within the programmatic remit of SRs, which focuses on some special areas. For instance, the elderly who are abandoned. This already is a massive problem in our society, which we are not recognizing. Traditionally, we tend to say that we don't need old homes, but we do, because children, husbands and wives are working, they are abandoning their elderly, and we do need old homes. So there's a category for them. There are accelerated initiatives for our workers abroad. There is another stream of planning for informal workers, and here I'm veering slightly from social safety towards social protection and social security. So the vast majority of our workers, the women in the rural areas, whose work is seen as an extension of their domestic work. Women work in villages, their work is not recognized. There are women in your and my homes who are actually workers, but they're not documented anywhere. So for the last 3 months, a labor expert group was constituted. They've come up with recommendations on how to incrementally move, especially these women as the first point, towards social security. And the first step is to give them bank accounts, to digitally and financially include them. because through that measure we can ensure that their minimum wage is being given to them, and subsequently then paving the way for them to be included in social security and social welfare. I mean, I could go on and on, how we've embedded our agenda into the housing initiative and many others. So this is just a summarized way of telling you that there's an accelerated drive to protect people so that they do not fall below the poverty line. For that, we've created an institutional architecture, and there are different programs focusing on different disadvantaged segments of the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saga. And the reason I wanted to prompt at one of the places was because probably the last part of your intervention actually also focuses on mitigation of horizontal and vertical inequalities in Pakistan, you know. And this is where I wanted to bring in the recent work by Dr. Hafiz Pasha. So you recently worked upon how privileges allowed in the system in the past to elites could be rationalized, you know, in this phase of current economic hardship, you know. So if you could just talk a bit briefly about that what were those privileges which were built into policy systems which really need to go now?
You know, speaking on the privileges of the elite or the vested interests of Pakistan requires a little bit of courage. And at the fag end of my life, I think I finally have the courage. Now, who are these vested interests? And you see, the difference that I would like to draw is privileges which are, in a sense, legitimate under law, which have been granted by rules, regulations, laws, and the so-called SROs and so on. I'm not talking about privileges which arise due to use of power, perhaps in a somewhat illegal fashion or whatever it may be. This is a system which recognizes privilege as legitimate. And therefore, there is a certain cost associated with it, and one needs to be careful in identifying what those privileges are. The first type of privileges are certain tax laws which allow for tax breaks, which allow for exemptions, which allow for almost a kind of a conducive environment for tax evasion. The other is the access to infrastructure, and believe me, in Pakistan, one of the real sources of privilege is access to land. Land is the main asset people aim for. I'm not talking just of agricultural land, I'm talking about land in the urban areas and in the urban rural periphery. The third is pricing, lower pricing of inputs officially, subsidies and hidden grants and so on. And the fourth and ultimate privilege is access to capital, privileged access. So these are the instruments of patronage, instruments of privilege, which in a sense are built into the system and recognized almost by practice and certainly in many cases by law. My students and I, 2 or 3 of my PhD students and we have been working on this. And as I said, this is a bold initiative, but let me just have the courage of at least identifying which are those privileged groups that we have been working on and give you some idea as to the extent of privilege. The first is, of course, the traditional elite of Pakistan, which is the feudal elite. And it's interesting, a very powerful statistic, which Agricultural Census actually officially publishes, 2010. 1% of the farmers of Pakistan own 22% of the land. That is the extent of inequality. And at the lower end, 26% of the farmers in my country do not even have 1 acre of land as their farm size. This is the skewness in the distribution of agricultural land. So the traditional elite also has incredible, if you like, exemption or almost pampered treatment with regard to payment of the agricultural income tax. Do you know how much we collect from the agricultural income tax in Pakistan today? From the 4 provinces combined, a gloriously large amount of rupees 2 billion. And we are collecting rupees 1,600 billion from the rest of Pakistan. This is the difference. The second privileged group is the military establishment. And it is interesting that beyond performing the functions of defense, the coverage of the establishment, today the largest conglomerate corporate entity is owned by the Fauji Foundation. The largest urban estate developer in the country by far are the defense housing authorities developing high value luxury plots for development. Then the third is very interesting. I recently discovered that the largest construction company in Pakistan is the Frontier Works Organization. Combined together, this is the extent of the outreach and the privilege linked to the military establishment. The third is, of course, we have the corporate sector. The fourth, we have the export companies and organizations. Fifth, we have high net worth individuals. Sixth, we have the senior echelons of Pakistan's esteemed bureaucracy. And finally, not to say the least, the members of the provincial and national assemblies. All told together, and I won't give you the separate figures, the total cost of the privileges granted to these privileged groups aggregates to rupees 2,150 billion rupees. And I was hearing Dr. Sania, and she was telling us that Ehsaas is getting 193 billion, and this is a breakthrough. The allocation by this new government for social protection and poverty alleviation is almost 3 times what previous governments had done, if that money does get spent. But it all adds up to 370 odd billion, and this is what we are doing for the poor. And on the other hand, the privileges of the rich are up to 2,150 billion, almost 6 times as much. Ladies and gentlemen, what more can I tell you about?
Doctor, thank you very much. I'm told that we have 2 to 4 minutes left, so probably it will be best to take some inputs from the floor. Now, just a word of caution. The panel won't be able to respond because there's a next session afterward. So for response, you can talk bilaterally, but there's something that you want to contribute to the debate, please feel free. Mic hai ji? Please. Introduce kara dijiyega, please.
Assalamu alaikum ji, this is Rashid Masood Alam. I'm a chartered accountant and a student of economics. Dr. Saab, my only question is to Dr. Saab. Dr. Saab, you said that the rupee is devalued. I mean, currently is 10% undervalued, instead of what we have been hearing about that this is overvalued, that kept overvalued purposely by the previous governments. So it's strange, basically. This is the first time I'm hearing that rupee is undervalued to an extent of 10%. We have foreign reserve at an extent, recently it dipped to 150 billion. As you said yourself. Yes, sir. So what is the mechanism through which you come to this figure that rupees 10% undervalued?
Okay, I'll just give you a very quick response. This is in fact the State Bank's own calculation. This is known as the real effective exchange rate. Go into the data set and you'll get the data. Let's focus on the questions.
जी आपका सवाल है जी
Hello.
जरा इख्तिसार के साथ
I'm Dost Mohammad Badish from Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad. I have a question from the panel which relates to CPEC and Pakistan's economic growth. Actually, we have heard most of the time that CPEC is a game changer. It has become a buzzword. But nevertheless, Pakistan's economic growth under CPEC is decreasing instead of increasing. So how do you see the Pakistan's economic growth in future as far as CPEC is concerned? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Sir, आपका था please. जी sir.
I have a simple question on data. What are the last confirmed figures of the prevalence of poverty in Pakistan in rupees, discounting for the depreciation of the rupee in terms of the dollar? And whether there has been any movement in the last 18 months in these figures, is there any guess or any indication? Thank you.
So we haven't had a lady. So maybe Amina. Ji.
Assalamu alaikum. So I'm Amina. I work at the Overseas Development Institute. My question is to Dr. Hafiz Pasha. I wonder if you can touch a bit about where you would start undoing some of the privileges within the system if you were given an opportunity to start.
Yes. So we'll just close, and I want to pick one question from our Twitter feed, which is to Dr. Sania about the fact that SAS is also focusing on social entrepreneurship for the first time. So how does that work out? So maybe we'll give 1 minute to Dr. Pasha and 1 minute to Dr. Sania, and then we'll close. And the other questions can be discussed bilaterally. Please, sir.
It is very unlikely that given my state of health and my position as a professor emeritus that I would be given the chance to remove some of those privileges. But we have come up with a series of recommendations on how the system could be worked better and perhaps more equitably. But you know, this requires a new social and political contract. If you want to remove these vastly entrenched privileges which have been there, almost taken for granted as a natural born or birthright, we will require a very profound process of change which is both political and social in character. I don't see it happening in the immediate future, unfortunately.
So just to quickly respond to the question from the Twitter feed on social entrepreneurship, as I was explaining, the Kifalat program under SAS, where there's been a paradigm shift in dealing with the 7 million women who receive cash transfers from the government of Pakistan. The idea is not to treat them as passive recipients of money. The idea is to spark the entrepreneurial potential within them, and the National Poverty Graduation Initiative was predicated on this understanding. Already launched on the 5th of July. There are thousands of opportunities every month for people to get interest-free loans and asset transfers. There's a dedicated agency which executes that. All the information is on our website. I also explained how the Agriculture Value Chain Development Initiative will provide opportunity for people at the bottom of the pyramid to benefit. We envisage investments from multinationals from the United States over the medium term. And my recent discourse with the State Department and the launching of the Women's Council, relaunching of the Women's Council again, was also focused on providing entrepreneurial opportunities and jobs opportunities for women. Also within the framework of SAS, you will notice that there are 3 areas which have been outlined where there is job potential despite slow economic growth over the next 2 years. Those are export of Pakistani workers abroad, skills and vocational training, and the information technology sector. So the various strands of planning are converging on the objective of making the opportunities available for people to work from home. And if we can get the payment systems done, the reform of the online payment systems turned around, then there could be a huge boost given to this. And already the numbers look very promising in this connection. So there are various strands of planning with regard to social entrepreneurship.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahaba. I think the panel, the esteemed panel, deserves a round of applause for this really making it very concise, making the arguments very concise, and really putting it in perspective. So I'm extremely grateful to Dr. Jochen Hippler, Mohammed Ziauddin Saab, Dr. Sania Nishtar, and Dr. Hafiz Pasha. I of course thank the excellent team of FES Pakistan in co-organizing this with the Oxford University Press. So it's back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, the audience. Thanks to the audience for attending the session.